I've always considered myself a private person, so when I noticed something odd glinting in the corner of my bedroom, my heart nearly stopped. At first, I thought it was just a spider's web catching the light, but as I moved closer, my blood ran cold. There, nestled between my bookshelf and the wall, was a tiny camera lens, no bigger than a button. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it, half hoping it wasn't real, but it was. The cold metal against my fingertips confirmed my worst fears. Someone had been watching me in my most intimate moments, invading the sanctuary of my bedroom. Panic set in as questions raced through my mind. How long had it been there? Who put it there? What had they seen? I felt violated, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. The walls of my home, once a source of comfort and security, now felt like a cage. I stumbled out of my bedroom, desperate for fresh air, but the feeling of being watched followed me. It was then that a horrifying thought struck me. If there was one camera, could there be more? With shaking hands, I began to search every nook and cranny of my house, praying I wouldn't find anything else. But as I moved from room to room, my worst fears were confirmed. My home was no longer my own. As I methodically searched my house, each new discovery sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. In the living room, a camera peered out from behind a family photo. In the kitchen, one was disguised as a smoke detector. Even my bathroom wasn't safe. A tiny lens was hidden in the shower head, watching me at my most vulnerable. With each camera I found, I felt more of my sanity slipping away. The invasion of my privacy was total and complete. Every moment of my life, every private conversation, every personal habit, all of it had been laid bare for some unknown voyeur. I tried to think rationally, to figure out who could have done this. A jealous ex, a creepy neighbor, but the level of sophistication in the camera placement suggested something more sinister. This wasn't just some amateur peeping Tom. This was a calculated, professional job. As night fell, I found myself huddled in a corner, surrounded by the pile of cameras I'd collected. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them. They were evidence, after all. But their presence mocked me, reminding me of how thoroughly my life had been violated. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every shadow on the wall became a potential threat. I kept imagining hidden cameras I might have missed, invisible eyes still watching me. The darkness that once brought comfort now felt oppressive, hiding untold horrors. Days passed, and my paranoia grew. I stopped going to work, afraid to leave my house unattended. What if the person behind this came back to replace the cameras I'd removed? Or worse, what if they were waiting for me to leave so they could confront me in person? I covered every window, taped over every electrical outlet, and even considered tearing down the walls to check for more hidden devices. My phone and computer were abandoned, convinced they too had been compromised. I became a prisoner in my own home, but even then I didn't feel safe. Sleep deprivation began to take its toll. I started seeing things, flashes of light in dark corners, shadows moving when they shouldn't. Were these hallucinations, or had I simply missed some cameras in my search? The line between reality and paranoia blurred more each day. I tried reaching out to the police, but without concrete evidence of who was behind this, they could do little more than file a report. Their sympathetic but helpless expressions only fueled my frustration and fear. I was on my own. As my mental state deteriorated, so did my grip on reality. I began talking to the cameras, pleading with my unseen watcher to leave me alone, to tell me what they wanted. Sometimes in my more unhinged moments, I found myself performing for them, as if I could somehow satisfy their voyeuristic appetite and make this all stop. But the silence was deafening, the mystery of my stalker's identity maddening. I knew I was spiraling, but I felt powerless to stop it. Weeks into my isolation, I hit rock bottom. I hadn't showered, barely ate, and slept in fitful bursts. My appearance in the mirror was that of a stranger, wild-eyed, disheveled, a shell of my former self. It was during one of these moments, staring at my reflection, that something in me snapped. I couldn't live like this anymore. The fear, the constant vigilance, it was killing me slowly. I decided that if I couldn't beat my unseen tormentor, I'd confront them head-on. I stood in the middle of my living room and shouted at the top of my lungs, challenging my watcher to show themselves. To my shock and horror, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Behind you," it read. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. another buzz. Not there, in the mirror. Trembling, I approached the large mirror hanging on my wall. As I peered into it, the reflection shifted, revealing a hidden room behind the glass. There, surrounded by monitors displaying every corner of my house, sat a figure in shadow. As they turned to face me, I felt the world tilt on its axis. The face staring back at me was my own, but older, weathered, eyes gleaming with a madness I recognized all too well. "Welcome," my doppelganger said. "I've been waiting for you to find me." My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. The room behind the mirror was a technological nightmare, screens flickering with live feeds from all over my house, computers humming with activity, and at the center of it all, this twisted version of myself. "Who? What are you?" I managed to stammer out. The other me smiled, a cold, mirthless expression. "I'm you, of course. Or rather, I'm what you become. I've come back to make sure it happens." As he spoke, the horrible truth began to dawn on me. This wasn't just some stalker or cruel prankster. This was a future version of myself, somehow traveled back in time, orchestrating my descent into paranoia and madness. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because it has to happen," he replied, his tone matter of fact. "The isolation, the fear, the loss of trust, it all leads to a breakthrough. In your future, my past, we make a discovery that changes everything. But it only happens because of this moment, because of what we go through here." I wanted to run, to deny this insane reality, but deep down I knew it was true. I could see my own capacity for this madness reflected in his eyes. "What happens now?" I asked, resignation creeping into my voice. My future self stood up, gesturing to the seat he'd vacated. "Now, you take my place. Watch, wait, and when the time comes, you'll understand why it was all necessary." As I stepped through the mirror, I realized my torment was far from over. It was just beginning. It all started on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. I was at my favorite coffee shop, sipping my usual latte and scrolling through my phone. That's when I first noticed him. A tall, slender man with piercing blue eyes and a face that was both unremarkable and unforgettable. He was sitting in the corner, pretending to read a newspaper, but I could feel his gaze boring into me. I brushed it off as paranoia, but later that day at the grocery store, I saw him again. This time, he was examining a can of soup with far too much interest. My heart raced as I realized this couldn't be a coincidence. Over the next few days, he appeared everywhere, at the park where I jog, outside my office building, even at the cinema I frequented. He never approached me, always maintaining a careful distance, but his presence was undeniable. I began to feel like a prey being stalked by a patient predator. Sleep became elusive, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Friends told me I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things, but I knew better. The fear was real, and it was slowly consuming me. After a week of this psychological torture, I decided I'd had enough. The next time I spotted him, lurking near my apartment building, I gathered all my courage and marched straight towards him, determined to confront my stalker and end this nightmare. As I approached him, my heart pounding in my chest, I noticed something odd. The closer I got, the more insubstantial he seemed. It was as if he was fading at the edges, like a mirage in the desert. When I was just a few feet away, I called out, "Hey, who are you? Why are you following me?" The man turned to face me, his blue eyes widening in what looked like surprise. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, in the blink of an eye, he vanished. Not ran away, not ducked behind something. He literally disappeared into thin air. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. Had I finally lost my mind? Was the stress causing me to hallucinate? I pinched myself, hard, but I was definitely awake. Shaken to my core, I hurried back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant siren had me bolt upright in bed, expecting to see those piercing blue eyes staring at me from the darkness. But nothing happened. The next day, I went about my routine, constantly on edge, but there was no sign of the mysterious stranger. Just as I was starting to think it had all been in my head, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl, was a small piece of paper that definitely hadn't been there when I left for work. With trembling hands, I picked it up. In elegant, old-fashioned handwriting, it read, "I'm always watching. You can't escape me." The note sent me into a panic. I called the police, but they were frustratingly unhelpful. Without any evidence of a break-in or concrete proof of stalking, they couldn't do much. They advised me to install security cameras and change my locks. I did both that very day, but it did little to ease my fear. The following weeks were a nightmare. Though I never saw the man again, I felt his presence everywhere. Objects in my apartment would move when I wasn't looking. I'd wake up to find my TV on, tuned to static. Once, I found wet footprints leading from my shower to my bedroom, despite living alone. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to leave but terrified to stay. My friends grew concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior, but how could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? I lost my job, my social life, and slowly my grip on reality. One night, unable to sleep, I sat in my living room with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, right next to my ear. "You're mine now." I swung the bat wildly, screaming, but hit nothing but air. Desperate for answers, I began researching local history, looking for any clues about my supernatural stalker. That's when I stumbled upon an old news article that made my heart stop. There, in grainy black and white, was a photo of my tormentor. The caption read, "Local man disappears without a trace, 952. The article detailed the mysterious disappearance of one Edward Livingstone, a reclusive writer who vanished from his home over 70 years ago. The resemblance to my stalker was uncanny. As I dug deeper, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Every few decades, there were reports of people in our town experiencing similar hauntings, always culminating in their disappearance. Armed with this knowledge, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. She listened to my story with a grave expression and agreed to help. We set up more cameras, EMF detectors, and even attempted a seance. For days, nothing happened. Then one night, all hell broke loose. It started with the lights flickering. Then, one by one, the cameras went dead. The EMF detectors screamed to life, their needles pinned to the max. A bone-chilling cold descended on the room, and in the center, a mist began to form, slowly taking the shape of Edward Livingstone. The investigator began an exorcism ritual, her voice strong and commanding. Livingstone's form writhed and distorted, letting out an otherworldly shriek that shattered every window in my apartment. I cowered in the corner, watching this battle between the living and the dead unfold before my eyes. Just when it seemed the investigator was winning, Livingstone's spirit lunged at me. I felt an icy grip around my throat, choking the life out of me. As darkness crept into the edges of my vision, I heard the investigator's voice, distant and fading. "Fight him. He can only take you if you give in." With my last ounce of strength, I focused on my will to live, to be free of this torment. I pictured a bright light pushing back the darkness, forcing Livingstone's spirit away from me. Suddenly, the pressure on my throat released, and I gasped for air. The investigator's chanting reached a crescendo, and Livingstone's form began to disintegrate, particles of ghostly mist scattering like dust in the wind. With a final, earth-shaking roar, he vanished, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by my ragged breathing. In the aftermath, the investigator explained that Livingstone had been a powerful psychic in life, obsessed with finding a way to achieve immortality. In death, he had discovered he could prolong his existence by latching onto the living, feeding off their fear, and eventually possessing them entirely. I had been his latest target. The haunting was over, but its effects lingered. It took months of therapy and support from friends to feel safe again. I moved to a new apartment, started a new job, and slowly rebuilt my life. But I never forgot my brush with the supernatural. Now, years later, I share my story as a warning. To those who feel watched, who sense a presence they can't explain, trust your instincts. The veil between our world and the next is thinner than we realize, and there are entities out there waiting for a chance to cross over. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we can't see. It all began innocently enough. A friend request on social media from someone I didn't recognize. I usually ignored these, but something about their profile picture caught my eye. They looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. I accepted the request, thinking maybe we had met at a party or through mutual friends. The first few messages were casual. They asked about my interests, my job, normal getting to know you stuff. I found myself enjoying our conversations. They seemed witty, intelligent, and we shared similar tastes in music and movies. It felt like I was making a new friend. But then, things started to shift. They began mentioning specific details about my life that I hadn't shared. At first, it was small things, the name of my high school, my favorite coffee shop. I brushed it off, assuming I must have mentioned these things and forgotten. Then came the message that sent a chill down my spine. I bet you looked beautiful in that red dress you wore to dinner last night. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't posted anything about going out to dinner, let alone what I was wearing. How could they possibly know that? I immediately checked my privacy settings, thinking maybe I had accidentally made my posts public. But everything was locked down tight. That's when the fear set in. Who was this person, and how did they know so much about me? I decided to confront them, demanding to know how they knew these details about my life. Their response was chilling. "I've been watching you, John. You fascinate me." Panic set in as I realized I was dealing with a stalker. I immediately blocked them on all social media platforms and changed my privacy settings. For a few days I thought that was the end of it, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The emails started flooding in. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They came from different addresses, but I knew it was the same person. The messages ranged from declarations of love to angry rants about how I was ignoring them. Some contained intimate photos of me, taken without my knowledge. I changed my email address, but somehow they always found the new one. I felt violated, exposed, and utterly helpless. My phone became a source of constant anxiety, buzzing with notifications from unknown numbers. One night, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice on the other end made my blood run cold. "Hello, John. I can see you through your bedroom window. That blue pajama top looks lovely on you." I slammed the curtains shut and called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone outside. The officers took a report, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The harassment escalated rapidly after that night. I started noticing strange cars parked outside my house, following me to work. Objects in my apartment would be slightly out of place, as if someone had been there while I was out. One day I came home to find a bouquet of roses on my doorstep. The card read, "Soon, my love." I threw them away, hands shaking, and double-checked all my locks. At work, my colleagues noticed my increasing paranoia. I jumped at every sound, constantly looking over my shoulder. My boss suggested I take some time off, concerned about my mental state. But the thought of being alone at home terrified me even more. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every stranger on the street became a potential threat. Was that the person who'd been tormenting me, or that one? The fear was all-consuming. Then came the day I'll never forget. I was grocery shopping when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see a face I recognized from that first social media profile picture. My blood ran cold as they smiled and said, "Hello, John. It's so nice to finally meet you in person." I dropped my basket and ran, heart pounding, not daring to look back. I could hear their footsteps behind me, getting closer. As I burst out of the store, I frantically searched for help, praying someone would notice my distress. By some miracle, a police car was parked nearby. I sprinted towards it, screaming for help. The officers inside quickly responded, and as they approached, I saw my stalker melt into the crowd and disappear. I broke down, finally telling the police everything. They took me seriously this time, given the in-person encounter. They assigned a detective to my case and advised me to stay with friends or family for a while. I moved in with my best friend, Sarah. She was incredibly supportive, but I could see the toll my situation was taking on her too. We installed security cameras, changed our routines, and lived in constant vigilance. For a few weeks, things seemed to calm down. No more calls, no more emails. I started to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But deep down, I knew better. One night, Sarah and I were watching a movie when her phone pinged with a text. Her face went pale as she showed me the screen. It was a photo of us, sitting on the very couch we were on, taken from outside the window. The message read, "Two for the price of one. How delightful." We called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. The officers suggested we leave town for a while, somewhere the stalker wouldn't know about. In a panic, we packed our bags and left that night, driving to Sarah's family cabin in the mountains. As we sped down dark, winding roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. The cabin was remote, with no internet and spotty cell service. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. We spent our days hiking, reading, and trying to forget the horror we'd left behind. But peace, it seems, was not in the cards for me. On our third night there, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heart racing, I shook Sarah awake. We huddled in silence, praying it was just an animal. Then came the knock. "I know you're in there," sang a sickeningly familiar voice. "You can't hide from me, John." Sarah called 911 as I searched frantically for a weapon. The door began to splinter under the force of heavy blows. Just as it gave way, we heard sirens in the distance. The stalker hesitated for a moment, then fled into the woods. The police arrived minutes later, but despite an extensive search, they couldn't find any trace of the intruder. As dawn broke, I sat wrapped in a shock blanket, giving my statement to a sympathetic officer. I realized then that this would never truly be over. Even if they caught my tormentor, the fear would always be with me. I made a decision in that moment. I wouldn't let this person steal my life. I would fight back, not just for myself, but for all the victims of stalking who live in fear every day. This is my story, but it's not over yet. To anyone out there facing a similar nightmare, you're not alone. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never stop fighting for your right to live without fear.